Hello everyone and welcome to another very exciting and fun game from round 4, or rather it's round 2 of the FTX Crypto Cup. It's actually game 4 of the match Anish Giri versus Praggnanandhaa, and the first 3 games ended in a draw. There was a lot of fight in those 3 games, but in the end no winner emerged, and now this is game 4. In the last game Anish has the white pieces, and it is quite a beautiful game. It's a very clean game, so I'm sure you guys are going to enjoy it as it features the Nimzo-Indian defense. So let's dive straight into it and see what happened here. Anish going into the match with a loss from round 1. He lost to Magnus Carlsen, and Praggnanandhaa, as you've seen, has defeated Alireza Firuza, so he has started this event with flying colors. So let's check it out. We have d4 by Anish, knight to f6, c4 e6, knight to c3, and as advertised, bishop to b4. The Nimzo-Indian defense is on the board, and pawn to e3 now. Just going for the standard line. We have castles, and now bishop to d3, the so-called bishop's attack against the Nimzo-Indian. d5 by Pragg. We have a3, now chasing away the bishop, and of course the bishop captures on c3. We've seen some games where white does not allow the doubling of the c-pawn, but we've also seen some games in recent chess where white allows it, and then white just gets a beautiful game with a lot of attacking potential. So here b captures on c3, d captures on c4, attacking the bishop, bishop captures, and just c5 by Pragg, knight to f3, and now queen to c7. And this is a position that has been used many times by many strong players. Bishop to e2. Usually when we get this position, as of course c captures on d4 is a threat, then the queen will be attacking the bishop. You have to move the bishop. So bishop to e2 is one way to do it. Bishop to a2 is the other way to do it. Bishop to e2 is a safer way. Bishop to a2 not so safe, but maybe a bit more exciting. So here bishop to e2, b6, now preparing to develop the light square bishop. We have bishop to b2, and now this position again has been reached many times. Anand defeated Carlsen from this position, Carlsen defeated Ding from this position, and Anish also had this position a few times with the black pieces himself. And usually bishop to b7 is the move that's played here, but I think Pragg prepared incredibly well for this game, and maybe he's even playing a bit of mind games here, and he plays c captures on d4, following the game Anish Giri played last year in the Superbet Classic against Wesley. So Anish having the black pieces here. So c captures on d4, and now developing the bishop to a6, offering a trade of light square bishops. We have castles by Anish, and now in that game that we've mentioned, Wesley versus Anish Giri, bishop captures on e2 was played, but here Pragg plays queen to b7, and it is now, as of move 13, that we have a completely new game. So rook to e1, Anish continues development. We have bishop captures on e2, queen captures, and now knight b to d7. So I'm sure you guys are wondering what's the point of the queen on b7. Well, it's actually a very deep idea. Pragg wants to play b5. He wants the queen to have the pawn to have support from the queen on b7, and then of course he wants to push b4, much like you would in any other position, as b4 most often wins the game for either player. And then once you trade off the pawns here, then you just have a passed a pawn, you push it, and you win the game. So here e4, Anish grabs the strong center here, rook 8 to c8, and now pawn to h3. We have b5 by Pragg, rook 8 to d1, centralizing the rooks, and pawn to h6, leaving the king some breathing room here, so you don't get back rank mated sometimes in the future. Knight to h2, and now pawn to b4. Pragg pushes the pawn and creates a pass pawn, whether it's going to be a pass b pawn by playing b3, or you will trade off the pawns and then you will have a passed a pawn. So Anish trades here. We have captures, and now comes rook to d3. Here it's a very difficult position for white, but if you don't know what to play exactly, it's not gonna just be completely apparent. Here you could play bishop to c1, you could play bishop to a1, you could reintroduce the knight into the game with knight to f1, then bring the knight over to g3, let's say. But Anish played rook to d3, and it seems like a beautiful active move. You can shift the rook into the attack, you can play bishop to a3, attack the queen. Once the queen moves, you win the rook here, but it is exactly the move that allows Pragg to gain not maybe the winning advantage, but at least just enough advantage to push for the win. So feel free to pause the video here and try to find the move Anish missed, and that allows Pragg to push for the win while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting that by playing rook to d3, Anish has basically blundered a pawn. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is rook to c2. Beautiful, beautiful move. Look at this, attacking the queen, sacrificing a full rook, or so it seems, because if the rook is captured, then you captured the rook on e1. But it is such an elegant move. We can even do one in slow motion. There you have it, like rook to c2. And you don't really have a good move here for Anish. Your best option is to just give up the pawn. If you trade this, for example, queen captures, now knight f1, you also lose the e4 pawn. So it doesn't matter how you play this, you will lose the pawn. So Anish says, okay, maybe there's a better way. Let's play bishop to a3. Now we are gonna win back some material, but still Pragg will win his pawn. Just rook captures on e2, bishop captures on b4, attacking the rook on f8, but it doesn't matter. Rook captures on e1 with check. You have to capture back with the bishop. Bishop captures, and now comes knight captures on e4. Again, similar position to what we already saw in that line. Pragg is up a pawn. He has a passed a pawn, and now the only question is, can Pragg win this? Anish is an incredibly strong player, so of course he will put up a very, very stubborn resistance. Will Pragg be able to break through? Let's see what happened. So d5, trading off this pawn, trying to mess up Pragg's pawn structure here. Knight d to c5 now with a tempo on the rook. Rook to a3, going after the a7 pawn, and now e captures on d5. And this is a very, very classy move by Pragg, converting one advantage to another, basically giving up this pass pawn for this pass pawn. Because if you try to defend your outside pass pawn, then there's f3, chases away the knight, once knight f6, bishop f2, and now it's already not looking as great for black as it did. So Pragg continues with the absolute best move, e captures on d5, f3 now, chasing away the knight before recapturing on a7, knight g5, and now rook captures on a7. So still, Pragg has the extra d pawn, and he will now try to set up the absolute perfect position to escort this pawn down the board. So rook to c8, rook to c8, defending the knight, and now rook to a1. Here Anish wants to put the rook in front of the pass pawn. We have knight g to e6, and now rook to d1. Putting the rook in front of the pawn, attacking the pawn. Now pawn to d4. Pragg starts advancing it. Knight to g4 now. We have rook to b8, preparing to infiltrate with the rook. Bishop to g3, attacking the rook, and rook to b3 now. We have knight to f2, and now knight to a4. Trying to get the perfect squares for those knights so you can start escorting your pawn. King to f1. Anish starts bringing the king into the game. Knight to c3 now, attacking the rook, and rook to a1. We have king to h7. And now comes bishop to d6. If you try rook to a7 to go after the f7 pawn, then the idea, of course, is rook to b1. With the e2 square covered, this is just resigned. So Anish can't even move the rook away from the back rank. So bishop to d6 here, now with some ideas of maybe playing bishop to a3, trying to get some sort of a barrier here against the passed d pawn. But now knight to d5. We have king to g1. King to g6, bringing the king deeper into the game. Rook to e1 now. We have h5 by Pragg, preparing h4 to completely cripple the white king. Bishop to e5, and now comes knight to e3. We have knight to e4, and now pawn to h4. So taking away pretty much all of the squares from white's king side. Knight to f2, and now knight to c4, putting pressure on the bishop here. And here Pragg actually gave Anish maybe a way to get back into the game, but it's very, very far-fetched. Here, if Anish wants to continue playing this, he has to play bishop captures on d4. It's a temporary piece sacrifice, point being that after knight captures on d4, you have rook e4. Now the two knights here are a problem. However, knight captures on f3 with check, g captures, and now knight to d2, attacking the rook and the f3 pawn. So rook g4 check, king to f5, rook captures on g7, and now knight captures on f3 with check, king g2. Now you're going to play knight to g5, and you get this position, which is essentially very much winning for Pragg, as this knight can move. Otherwise, you're going to lose the h3 pawn. The f7 pawn is is defended. The rook doesn't really have all that many great moves, so you will win this, but it requires a lot of work. So here, but it was maybe the best attempt. After bishop to h2, now there is no stopping the pawn. We have pawn to d3 by Pragg, knight e4, and now pawn to d2. We have rook to d1, and now rook to d3, preparing knight to e3, king to f1. Here Anish trying to say that knight to e3 doesn't really work because he has king to e2, but it actually does work. But yeah, okay, he convinced Pragg, but I will show it. If knight to e3 check, king e2 attacking the rook, you just trade. Knight captures, king captures, and now there is knight to e3. This is the magic move. Now, of course, if king captures, knight f1 check picks up the bishop, but the real problem is, what if the knight captures? Well, then the point is knight captures on g2, and you will still win this position, as of course knight to f4, once it lands, it goes after the h3 pawn, you will win at least one more pawn and then the game. But you know, it looks like a weird position, and especially when you have little time on the clock and there's a knight on the board, things are never certain, and when there are 3 knights on the board, you just stop calculating. Like if you're playing blitz, there are 3 knights on the board, you have little time, you don't calculate. It's impossible to calculate. No one can do it, so don't even try it. So of course, Pragg goes for the elegant solution, pawn to f5. This requires no calculation. Knight to f2, and now rook back to d7, just keeping everything intact. Knight to e3 check, of course, is still a big problem. So rook to a1, and now knight to e3 with check. King e2, and now knight to d4 with check, saying, okay, if you capture on e3, I have knight to c2 check, then I'm going to win your rook on a1. So king captures on d2, but now all sorts of nasty discoveries are lurking, and of course Pragg goes for the cleanest one. Knight to b3 check, just winning the exchange, and now it's a matter of technique. So here, king captures, knight captures on a1, we have knight to d3, and now knight to c2 with check. King to e2, we have knight d4 check, king e3, knight to c2 check, and king to e2. So Anish still not giving up. Of course, he still will fight. If Pragg makes one little silly move, then Anish can bounce back into the game. King to h5, now we have knight to f4 with check. King back to h6, now comes knight to d3, knight to d4 with check, king e3, and now knight to e6. So Pragg has to make everything perfect before he starts pushing those pawns, and of course the rook will always be stronger than the bishop. So here, pawn to f4 by Anish, rook to a7, and now bishop to g1, trying to get the bishop back into the game. Rook to a3, and now king to e2. We have rook a2 check, king to f3, king to h5 now, and bishop to e3. So putting another defender to the f4 pawn. So if it is attacked, you don't have to worry about it. So rook a3, attacking the knight. Now just king back to e2. Anish says that this is you know, a very reasonable blockade. How are you gonna break through here? As you can see, this pawn and this pawn are preventing the black king from entering the game any deeper. So here, rook b3, Pragg wastes a move, knight to e5 now, and rook to b4. Now again, putting pressure on this f4 pawn. It's attacked twice, so we have to defend it. Knight d3, Anish defends, and now rook to a4. We have king to f3, and now knight to c7. Now it's time to bring the knight to an even more active square. Bishop to d2, and now we have knight to d5. Again, the f4 pawn is being pressured, so king to e2. Luckily, both your knight and bishop are defending the f4 pawn. Now rook to a2. Just limiting the movement of Anish's pieces. King to e1, and now knight to f6, preparing to activate the knight even further. We have knight to f2, now comes knight to e4, and your bishop is hanging, and also here you just have to trade knights. So knight captures on e4, f captures on e4, and now okay, now it's a clean rook against the bishop, but still, you give Anish one move, you make one silly move, and Anish will make this unwinnable for you. So here, pawn to f5, very, very clever move by Anish, keeping that black king stuck on the H file, not allowing Pragg's king to enter the game. But you don't need the king actually to win this. Rook to b2, king to e2, now comes rook to b5, going after the pawn because it's on a light square, so you don't really have a way of defending it. Bishop to c3, going after g7, but now Pragg just shows how simple it is to win this. Rook captures, bishop captures, and rook g5, attacking both bishop and pawn. So bishop d4, bishop to d4, rook captures on g2, and now king to e3. We have rook to g3 check, trading down even further. King captures, rook captures, and now king to f4. We have rook to b3, and now bishop to f2. So if Anish can somehow eliminate the h-pawn, then he will be getting a draw. However, pawn to h3, bishop to g1, and now just rook to b2. And it was in this position on move 81 that Anish Giri resigned the game, and by winning game 4, Pragg wins the entire match. So Pragg is now the only person on 2 out of 2, as is Magnus Carlsen after his yesterday's victory over Hans Mock and Niemann. You've seen that Magnus lost the first one, and then he just crushed Niemann in the other 3 games. But Pragg defeated Alireza very, very convincingly, and then he defeated Anish. So everyone is very much looking forward to Pragg versus Magnus, but that is only coming in round 5, as you guys probably know. So here after rook b2 you resign, there is no defense against h2, you will have to give up your bishop, and then it's just game. And of course if you try king here to keep an eye on the h2 square, then of course rook to g2 check picks up the bishop, and that's just it. You're gonna capture here, rook captures here, and now it's a very, very clean win for black. If you want to see, it's actually a forced mate in 6, king h2, now rook anywhere along the g file, king h3, rook to g5, king to h2, king to h4, and now after king to h1, king to g3, king to g1, only move, and now rook anywhere, basically along along the 5th rank. You take away the f1 square from the king, king h1, only move, and now rook to f1 with check. It seems pointless to maybe explain this, but if you've ever had this position in bullet, like playing bullet on leeches or on chess.com, and you have like 3 seconds on the clock, and your opponent's king is still in the middle of the board, it's very, very important to really know how to do this in the least amount of moves possible. So there are situations where this, understanding this can come in very, very handy. So after rook to b2, Anish resigned, and this means that Pragg has defeated Anish Giri. So the quote above the board definitely stung a bit after Anish posted it on Twitter. But yeah, what are you going to do? Pragg is amazing. He is so far unstoppable, and we'll see how he does in round 3. So yeah, that's the game. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Always study the endgame and play the Nimzo-Indian. You can see that many great players are creating great victories with the Nimzo-Indian defense. I would like to thank Ricky Yamini, excellent subscriber, Brendan Ward, Johan Clayson, and Raymond Raphael for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the FTX Crypto Cup until it finishes. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.